Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are diving right into the Atlantic world, specifically looking at colonial America between 1607 and 1754. If you really want to master the roots of American history, well, you need a solid game plan, and that's exactly what we're going to build together right now. To give you an idea of the sheer scale of this topic, you should know that this era requires a massive deep dive. In a standard curriculum, this material covers 14 full class periods. We aren't just skimming the surface here, guys. We're talking about digging into 2 to 3 weeks of absolutely foundational history.
So why does all this matter? Well, this single era actually accounts for a solid 6 to 8% of the total AP exam. From European rivalries to regional economics, mastering these concepts literally translates into measurable points on test day. Let's make absolutely sure you lock those down.
Okay, here is our roadmap for today. We're going to look at contextualizing colonial America, European goals and rivalries, the regions of the British colonies, trade and colonial slavery, and finally cultural interactions and conflicts. Let's dive right into Section 1, Contextualizing Colonial America.
The core historical skill we need here is contextualization. Now, what does that actually mean in plain English? Basically, it's about figuring out how preceding developments, like the Columbian Exchange, for instance, directly shape the events we are studying right now. It's kind of like a giant puzzle. You simply cannot understand 1607 without knowing what happened in the century right before it.
To build this context yourself, you can try this really handy 4-step framework. First up, assign a major historical factor, like Indigenous resistance. Second, write one crystal-clear sentence explaining how it influenced an event. Third, choose the best group response to refine that thought. And fourth, and this is absolutely crucial, brainstorm specific historical evidence to back it up. Broad themes are great, but hard evidence? That is what actually wins the argument. Think of this as your analytical toolkit for the entire era. We aren't just sitting around memorizing dates anymore. We are actively applying critical reasoning. Whether you're tracking the causation of transatlantic trade or comparing colonial regions across these 8 specific topics, this framework is your key to mastery.
Moving on to Section 2, let's zoom in on European goals and rivalries.
What's really fascinating here is the stark contrast in what these different European players actually wanted. On one hand, you have the French and the Dutch, who were heavily invested in the fur trade, which meant they needed vast mobility. But on the other hand, the British completely prioritized putting down permanent roots for agricultural settlements. These fundamentally different goals for land and labor drastically shaped their politics and, of course, their relationships with native populations.
Let's turn to Section 3 and narrow our focus to the regions of the British colonies.
Okay, so while the early British colonies successfully set up shop along the Atlantic coast in the 17th century, they were far from a united monolith. In reality, stepping into a settlement in New England was practically like landing on a different planet compared to the massive agricultural powerhouses of the Chesapeake or the southern colonies.
The main takeaway here is that these regional differences definitely didn't just happen by accident. They reflected a really unique blend of 4 key factors: environmental, economic, cultural, and demographic. Think about it. The rocky soil of the North practically forced a different economy than the rich, fertile soil of the South. Toss in different religious groups bringing distinct cultural norms, and bam, it's this exact combination of variables that gave each region its unique identity.
Let's zoom back out to the macro level for Section 4, trade and colonial slavery.
Just like other European empires in the Americas, the English colonies developed a deeply brutal system of enslavement. But what you really need to understand is that this system actually adapted to fit the specific economic, demographic, and geographic demands of the regions. The massive, labor-intensive agricultural needs of certain colonies became inextricably and tragically tied to human bondage.
Now, at the exact same time all this is happening, deep transatlantic exchanges were taking off. We're talking commercial, religious, philosophical, and political ideas just flowing back and forth across the ocean. These dynamic exchanges were actually tying the colonists closer to Britain and, kind of surprisingly, closer to each other as well. The colonies were evolving and becoming this deeply integrated part of a massive Atlantic network.
And finally, Section 5, we look at cultural interactions and conflicts.
As you can probably guess, when rapidly expanding empires and indigenous populations inevitably collide, things get incredibly volatile. Competition over resources definitely spurred on innovation and trade between the European rivals and American Indians. But, this mutual reliance was absolutely a double-edged sword, and it simultaneously fueled intense and often violent conflicts all across the continent.
Which leads us to this really fascinating historical paradox. The British colonies found themselves caught in this weird duality. Their constant political and cultural exchanges created these incredibly strong, loyal bonds with Great Britain. Yet, those exact same exchanges, mixed with their fiercely independent regional identities, were simultaneously sparking the earliest resistance against British control. Crazy, right?
So, as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a critical question to chew on. How did these very transatlantic ties, the trade, the philosophy, the shared culture that tethered the colonies so tightly to the motherland, ultimately plant the seeds for their own organized rebellion? It's a huge contradiction. Keep that in mind as you study. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep thinking critically.